Hey everyone, this is Eric Bond, the founder of Beat The GMAT, and we have a great webinar today. It's called Building a Story Strategy for MBA Applications. And for today's webinar, we're going to discuss how to build an application story that'll resonate with admissions officers so you can present your best side to the business schools, a very, very important skill to learn. Joining us today are some of our favorite co-hosts, AcceptU, and the co-founder of AcceptU, Marc Zawel. So before I hand it off to Marc, I just want to say a few words about the AcceptU firm, as well as Marc. So when you have a chance, I highly recommend you take a look at that URL that's listed right in front of you, acceptu.com. Really great resource. AcceptU is a firm that was developed by a team of former Ivy League admissions officers, and they have a mission to leverage technology to improve college and MBA applicants' chances to getting admitted to top schools and programs of their choice. And they have a very unique value prop. I think they are really good about leveraging technology. They also have wonderful one-on-one virtual counseling. So what if you're impressed with the topic that you see today, I think it gives you a nice flavor for the kinds of services that you can receive from AcceptU if you choose to become a client of theirs. A little bit about Marc Zawel. So as I mentioned, he's the co-founder and CEO of AcceptU. I always love giving this introduction of Marc because I can say that he literally wrote the book on admissions to highly selective colleges. He's the author of Untangling the Ivy League. Marc himself is also intimately knowledgeable about what it takes to get into the most selective higher education programs on the planet. He went to Cornell for his undergrad and has an MBA from UNC Kenan-Flagler, great school. And of course, he has plenty of direct admissions experience himself. So at UNC Kenan-Flagler, he chaired the admissions advisory board and evaluated application essays. And since 2004, over the last 8 years, Marc has also conducted alumni interviews for Cornell. So I think we can safely say that we have an expert in the house today. So again, before I hand off to Marc, just one more quick note too. We will have Marc go through his presentation in the next couple of seconds. He'll have the floor probably between 40 and 50 minutes, whatever time he needs. And with whatever time that does remain at the very end of this presentation, Marc is going to stick around to do a live Q&A with you. So if you have a question which you would like to pose to Marc, you can do so by entering your question on the right-hand side of your screen in this GoToWebinar control panel. There's a chat area, and you can just go ahead and chat in your questions. Do that throughout the presentation as questions come up. At the end, during our live Q&A, our team is going to look at the questions coming in, and I'll help to facilitate and moderate that Q&A, and we'll go through as many of your questions as we can with the time that remains. So Marc, happy holidays to you, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar.
Thanks for the introduction, Eric. Thanks everyone for being here. Happy holidays in advance. It's great that you all are thinking about applying to business school just with the holidays around the corner. But the topic we're going to cover today, we feel is a critical foundational element of every business school application. And so let's get to understanding how you build a story strategy. There's a lot of discussion about needing a story, but I want to take today to really dive into the nitty gritty. Oops, let me just pull that back up. Let's see what we got going on here. There we go. So I won't have to reiterate Eric's introduction, but just quickly, AcceptU, as he mentioned, is a group comprised entirely of former MBA admissions officers from top 25 programs, and we work with our clients one-on-one virtually, so exclusively by phone, Skype, and email. And our counseling has helped hundreds of applicants, we feel, gain a competitive advantage and get admitted to the business schools of their choice. As Eric mentioned, my background really has been in admissions. My colleague and co-founder here at AcceptU, Stephen Friedfeld, has over 10 years of admissions experience as well, both at Cornell and Princeton. And then all of our counselors, as I mentioned, are former MBA admissions officers, which we feel puts them in a unique position to provide applicants with inside knowledge and guidance that ultimately will allow them to differentiate themselves and improve their chances of getting admitted. So building a story strategy, there are four broad topics that I want to cover, and we will go into lots of details. First, we're going to start by thinking about what is an application story. As I mentioned, there's a lot of talk about application stories, needing a logical story, or a compelling story. What exactly is a story? Why then is your application story important? Again, there's so much talk of needing this type of compelling and strong application story, but before you get into understanding how to build your application story, let's first talk about why it's going to be a critical piece of your application. We'll then go into building your application story and positioning your application by answering, we feel, three key questions. And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking about, now that you have your story, how are you going to incorporate this story into your application? So let's start with that first topic. What is an application story? So in the simplest terms, an application story is a logical, compelling, and rational argument for why you should gain entry to a business school. And we talk about it needing to be logical, compelling, and rational for a reason. Your application story is not simply the story about why you are interested in pursuing an MBA. Your application story needs to follow a logical story arc, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Your story, again, this might sound obvious, is the message that you want admissions officers to hear. Admissions officers can draw their own conclusions about your story. You don't want them to. You want to own your story. You want to tell your story because you are going to be the most vocal advocate for why you should be admitted to a business school. So your story is the messaging and the positioning of yourself in the application process. And it's important for you to own your story and not let others tell your story for you. Finally, and this ties into that concept of your story being logical, compelling, and rational, but your story needs to also be relevant to your background, your future career interests, as well as those qualities that make you unique. And we're going to talk much more about your background, your future career interests, how we tie these together with a story, as well as playing up those differentiators or those qualities that make you unique. Now, in talking initially about the application story, I thought it's really important to emphasize the need for you to become someone to admissions officers. Your story is the primary way in which you will become someone to admissions officers beyond just your GMAT or your GPA. Someone who admissions officers can feel a connection with. If you think about it, the applicant pool to most top, say, 20 or top 25 business schools is quite self-selecting in that most applicants have the academic qualifications. And by academic qualifications, I mean both GMAT as well as GPA, to be admitted to the program. When you look at GPA, of course, there are other variables that come into play, such as where you attended your college or university, the rigor of the program or the major in which you were enrolled, the rigor of the coursework. So the GPA can be a little bit more complex than just a number. But when it comes to GPA, when it comes to GMAT, this is really not a way for you to differentiate yourself, unless, of course, you are at the very, very high end, in which case, if you have close to an 800 on your GMAT, if you have above a 4.0 or you've made Dean's List, then certainly academic distinctions and excelling academically will allow you to differentiate yourself. But recognize that most applicants are going to fall into a pile in which they are academically qualified to be admitted to the school. the way that admissions officers are then going to evaluate applicants is based on who this applicant is. What does this applicant bring to the table? What is this applicant interested in? How will this applicant contribute to our community? This is all told through your story. The more compelling your story is around the fit with the business school, the more likely you are to be admitted. And again, just like the story, and I put story in quotation marks, the fit is another term that's thrown around quite frequently when it comes to business school admissions. So I want to talk next about specifically how the key to your story foundation is fit. And at its simplest definition, fit is when you make it clear that an MBA program will help you achieve your goals. Why is fit so critical? Well, fit is critical for two reasons. The first is that when you're evaluating programs and business schools that you want to pursue or attend, you have to make sure that it is a good fit given your future career interests. Fit should help you build a list of programs that you feel will help you achieve your goals. So in many ways, understanding which business schools are a good fit for you can help you build the list of programs that you should be targeting. Now, beyond helping you build a list of schools to target, fit is an important criteria that you should be considering in the admissions review process, because admissions officers want to admit applicants that fit with their program. The reason being, those applicants that fit with a program have realistic expectations about what they will be able to achieve coming out of the program. You have to remember that business schools are businesses and students are their customers. And business schools are in the business of producing satisfied customers, because satisfied customers tend to give back in monetary ways and other ways. So if you are not a good fit for a specific business school and you have unreasonable expectations, or you have not identified programs that are aligned with your interests, you'll generally not be successful coming out of the program. You'll be unhappy, you'll be unsatisfied, which will impact giving and ranking and reputation and so forth. For these reasons, it's critical that you only apply to business schools that you have the right programmatic fit with. You can't really fake interest. If you have interests that are not aligned with what a business school can offer you, it's very easy as an admissions officer to see right through it. You have to keep in mind that admissions officers are reviewing thousands of applications. And so seeing what applicants are genuine in their interest and in their fit, and which applicants are really pushing the boundaries of what a good fit is, becomes quite easy when you review thousands of essays and review thousands of applicants. When you're considering fit, we encourage our clients to think about the school's programs. Now, that can be academic program, whether it's coursework or activities, professors. It can also be about location or more personal preferences. Keep all of those in mind and think about how does your fit with a particular school and how will that help you achieve your goals. That's how you start to build the foundation of your story. Why is your application story important? So we've started talking a bit about what the story is. Let's talk more now specifically about why it's a critical component to your applications. If you don't tell your story, as I said earlier, admissions officers will draw their own conclusions, or they'll simply draw none at all, both of which will hurt you in the process. You have to essentially feed your story to admissions officers on a plate. You have to make it very clear to them your story, and your story has to be simple, and it has to be logical, and it has to be rational, as I mentioned earlier. And I can't emphasize it enough that you have to own your story and you have to tell your story, because if you don't, again, admissions officers really won't draw the same conclusion that you want them to conclude too. Your story needs to demonstrate rational expectations about postgraduate goals. We talked about this in the previous slide. If you are interested in an area that you know is highly competitive to gain entry into, maybe you're interested, for example, in entrepreneurship. Maybe you have no past entrepreneurial experience, but you say that you're interested in starting your own business after you graduate. As an admissions officer, that might raise a red flag, because what I'll say is generally those students that are interested in entrepreneurship don't have access to the same type of on-campus recruiting, which means that this applicant is going to have a self-initiated job search. And if this applicant does not have any previous entrepreneurial experience, does this applicant really understand what he or she is getting himself into? So be careful when you define your short-term and your long-term goals, and make sure that your goals are attainable given your past experience as well as the resources that business school is going to provide you with. Recognize also that admissions officers, as I mentioned earlier, are inundated with similarly academically qualified applicants. Your story is the primary way for you to stand out. MBA admissions, and we hear this very frequently from our clients about concerns over their well-roundedness. We'll have clients come to us and say, well, I don't have any volunteer experience. Is this going to hurt me in the process? Or my experience has only been focused in one particular industry. Is that going to hurt me? And the reality is that admissions officers are not looking to admit well-rounded applicants. If you are a well-rounded applicant, then all the more power to you. But the reality is that most applicants are not fully well-rounded, and that's okay. Because what admissions officers are doing is building well-rounded classes. That's why it's all the more important for you to be clear about what role you will fill in that class. Because if you're not clear with what role you will fill, it's going to be difficult for admissions officers to place you within the class. Finally, admissions officers are human, and they want to admit applicants that they like. Your story is really the opportunity that you have, maybe outside of, say, your interview, to come across as likable. And this concept of likability is something that I want to talk next about, because it sounds somewhat trite that admissions officers admit applicants or students that they like. But why is it important to come across as likable as it relates to your story? Admissions officers want to admit students who will contribute to the diversity and the vibrancy of their community. And then admissions officers are people, and they want to admit applicants that they like because these are future students that they will be interacting with on campus. These are future students that they want to represent their school well. So in developing your story, an overarching goal we feel must be to come across as personable and likable. And I know right now that there are probably some of you saying, well, how do you do that? And we'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. So we've talked about what is an application story. We've talked about why your application story is important. I want to next talk about actually building your application story and the steps that you can go through to form the foundation and create a story that will help you stand out in the process. So how do you build your story? Start by answering, or at least thinking about 3 questions. These are, we feel, overarching questions that you have to consider part of your story. First, why do you want to pursue an MBA? And when we work with our clients on developing their stories, and we start with this initial question, we'll often hear, well, this is so obvious. Here's why I want to pursue an MBA. But remember, the rationale for why you want to pursue an MBA has to be something that is attainable and realistic. And it has to also be something that perhaps allows you to stand out in the process. So the answer to why you want to pursue an MBA can actually be far more complicated than you think it is. And the other thing to keep in mind when it comes to thinking about why do you want to pursue an MBA is that you can talk about why you want to pursue an MBA in your application materials, and then pursue something different when you enroll in business school. Business schools are not going to hold you to it, but you might think about your rationale for going to business school in your application materials in a different way than what you ultimately end up pursuing when you are in business school. The second question is, why do you want to pursue an MBA now from a particular program? The third question is, what makes you different? And what will you contribute? And actually, that third question is probably, well, I would say that they're all equally important, but certainly it's that last question that will allow you in the most impactful way to stand out in this highly competitive process. Keep in mind these questions whether or not you are directly prompted of them or not. There are many schools that will directly ask these questions of you, say in the essays, but others might not. And if they don't, you still need to think about ways to tell your story in answering these three questions. And once you have a baseline for these questions, then you can start to thread your answers and your messaging throughout your application. And that's what we'll talk about in that fourth and final section, is how do you incorporate your messaging, how do you incorporate your story in your application materials. Let's dig a little bit deeper into this first question of why do you want to pursue an MBA? Think first about, why are you looking to go to business school? Are you trying to accelerate your career, or are you trying to change your careers? And typically, business school applicants fall into one category or the other. If you are looking to accelerate your career, I would pose a question to you. Why can't you accelerate your career without an MBA? And start to list actually the reasons why you won't be able to accelerate your career without this degree. And be thinking about how you're going to articulate the reasons why you need this degree in order to achieve your goals. If you are changing careers, and it turns out that the majority of applicants, at least in our experience working with clients, are going to business school in order to change careers, the rationale for pursuing an MBA is a little bit easier to justify. Because if you're accelerating your career, and I come back to you and say, well, how come you can't pursue, or how come you can't accelerate your career without an MBA? It can be difficult to justify. But if you are changing your careers and you're going, say, from operations or consulting, and you want to now go into marketing, it's certainly a lot easier to say, well, I need business school in order to make this type of career transition. But just because it might be easier to justify your interest in pursuing an MBA through a career change does not necessarily mean that your story should include a career change. Because indicating an interest in changing careers can actually have its own set of challenges. So if you are interested in changing your career, consider some questions. And these are questions that admissions officers will likely have in the back of their minds while reviewing your application. First, why do you want to change careers? What can you point to in your personal or your professional past that can back up this interest? So let's go back to that example. If you're working in consulting and now you want to go into marketing, what have you done in the past that has given you exposure to marketing? What skill sets, perhaps, that you have developed as a consultant are transferable to the function that you want to fill in marketing? You need to be able to point to certain things. If it's not skills, maybe there's been a specific project that you've been engaged on, or you've had exposure to that, to marketing. Maybe you've had a mentor that you have developed a relationship with, and that has given you exposure. Maybe there are certain personal experiences that you have had. Maybe you've gotten involved in extracurricular activities. If you're suddenly interested in going into sustainability or entrepreneurship or finance, what is it that you can point to that can justify that? So changing careers and indicating an interest in changing careers as part of your story is not as easy as simply saying, I'm changing careers, and that's why I want to go to business school. You then need to justify why you are interested in changing your careers. And the reason why admissions officers want to see you point to certain experiences or skills that you've built is it all ties back into whether you are going to be able to achieve those goals. Are those goals attainable given your past experiences and the resources that are available to you in business school. And if you have no, if we go back to that example about entrepreneurship and starting a business, well, if you've had no experience in entrepreneurship, you might not fully understand what starting a business is really all about. And so that's why they want to see you reference those types of past experiences or skills in changing a career, and that has given you some exposure to that career that you are interested in now pursuing after business school. Let's talk now about why do you want to pursue an MBA now? That second question is two parts. The first is why do you want to pursue an MBA now? And the second part is why do you want to pursue an MBA now from this particular program? So let's focus first on the now. Whether you have less work experience, whether you have more work experience, whether you have the exact same amount of work experience as the average applicant at the business schools that you are targeting, you need to create a sense of timeliness and urgency in your application. How would you reply to an assessment from an admissions officer that essentially said, you should apply to business school in a few more years? Sit down in the same way that you're thinking about changing careers or accelerating careers and start to build a list of reasons why now is the time. Why not next year? Why not in 2 years? If you are changing careers, you need to explain why now is the time for you to do so. What has happened in the last 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever it is, that now you feel like is the time for you to apply to business school. If you are accelerating your career, you need to, again, explain how not immediately achieving your goals through business school will be detrimental to you in some respect. Meaning, if you don't come to business school and you're not able to build those skills that you're looking to build in order to accelerate your career, what will happen? Maybe you can emphasize that at this point in your career, you see yourself stalling or stagnating and you don't see the same type of progression. Maybe you can point to others that are in positions that you are interested in that have an MBA as a requirement. Maybe there's also personal reasons. Perhaps maybe you're starting a family. Maybe you have to settle down. Whatever, whether it's personal or professional, whether you are accelerating your career or changing your career, build a strong argument in your story as to why you must attend business school this year. The second part of that question, why an MBA from a particular business school, goes back and ties into the fit that we talked about a little bit earlier. Business school needs to be your bridge between where you are today and where you are going. Your story also needs to include references as to why a particular business school is going to help you achieve your goals. It turns out that business schools are different. You can say that whether they're in the top 10 or top 25, they have many of the same strengths. Maybe they have a focus on leadership. Maybe they have strengths in consulting. But the reality is that every business school is different. And you need to treat every business school as a different school that you will potentially be attending. Start by identifying programs that are the right fit. We talked earlier about how you can do that. You can look at both professional or academic reasons as to why the school is a good fit, whether it's courses, professors, career services. You can also talk about personal reasons, whether it's location, distance from home or your family, the type of community that it's in, whether your spouse or significant other also has a job opportunity there. This type of research into the fit will better inform your research about which schools to target, and it'll also make it easier for you to develop your story as to why that particular program is of interest to you. Now, in doing your research, whether it's academic, personal, or otherwise, it's important for you to go above and beyond what most applicants are doing. And the reality is that most applicants, when it comes to researching business schools and their fit with a business school, are doing really the bare bones. They're going onto a school's website, they're reading about some of the programs, they're reading about some of the clubs, they're reading about some of the professors, and then they're incorporating into their story interest in being president of this club or an interest in working with this particular professor. And to be quite frank, this is really something that is expected of you. Now, you can do that or you can go above and beyond. And if you're applying to schools that are admitting 10% or 15% or 20% of applicants, you have to go above and beyond. 8 out of 10 applicants that are doing the exact same thing as you, that are probably academically qualified in the same way that you are getting rejected. So how do you go above and beyond what most applicants are doing in their research? Well, you have to demonstrate interest in very real and impacting ways. You want to reach out to current students, you want to reach out to alumni. Perhaps there are alumni in your local area from that particular program. Can you get in touch with them? Can you grab a cup of coffee? Can you learn more directly from someone that has been through the program? Can you reach out to admissions officers on campus and try to learn more about the program and demonstrate interest in that particular program? We even go so far as to say you can contact those that are in career services. Think about talking with the employee who's responsible for managing on-campus recruiting for the particular industry or function that you're interested in pursuing. Learn more about what the opportunities are. Speak with professors. Don't just research them, but send them an email. Try to get a sense of how that particular class or that particular professor will give you more in the program to help you achieve those goals. Now, through all these points of research and all these points of contact, of course, you want to not go overboard, but it can help you, both in terms of giving you a better sense of what this program is all about, and also allowing you to cite those points of contact in your story. And when we get to the final section of this presentation on how you weave your story into your application, we can talk more about citing these types of points of contact, whether it's in your essays or otherwise. You want to reference and make known the points of contact that you have made with the school that has informed your research and allowed you to be in a position where you can confidently say, this program is the right fit for me, unlike other programs that I am looking at. That final question is about what makes you different and unique. And why do you want to pursue an MBA? Why do you want to pursue an MBA now from this particular program? These are critical questions for you to be answering and addressing. But again, it's going to be difficult for you to stand out in the process. Now, the best means for you to do so is by thinking very seriously about this final question. We think that it's probably the most important question to weave into your overall story, and that you should be considering both professional, excuse me, as well as personal differentiators. Professionally, do you have unique prior work experience? Is your work experience in an area that is perhaps not as common as what other business school applicants have in terms of their past work experience? Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be non-traditional. You don't need to have been a journalist or worked in nonprofit or the government, which are, say, less traditional career paths to come from. Now, if you are coming from those types of areas, certainly that will help you here. But think about your prior work experience. Is your work experience different in some way? Have you had an opportunity for leadership? Have there been accomplishments or responsibilities or achievements that you have had that others have not had? Start to write these down. In the same way that you're listing other parts of building your story, be listing these as well. Because overall, you'll take these and then you'll start to formalize your story. Think finally about your future career interests. Now, if you're interested in an area that far fewer are interested in, that will help you in standing out. Remember that admissions officers are building well-rounded classes. They can't have an entire class filled with students that have expressed an interest in going into, I don't know, management consulting. So if your future career interests are somewhat different or unique, play that up, because you are going to fill one of those slots and one of those roles that admissions officers are looking to fill. This is when some of the strategy comes into your story, because if you have a particular interest or a future career interest that is perhaps not as well represented, and you can justify that interest in that area, that might be a way of positioning your application to stand out. Now, ultimately, what you do when you get to business school, as I mentioned earlier, makes no difference to me. But you might think about, okay, based on my past experience, what future career interest makes the most sense? Are there more unique future career interests that will help me stand out professionally? Personally, you want to consider other criteria that make you different. And if you're having a difficult time being someone unique and different professionally, then certainly think about your personal attributes. Do you have unique interests? Do you have unique hobbies? Are you an avid yo-yoist? What makes you a little bit unique and different? Do you have any diversity, whether it's geographic diversity, whether it's gender diversity, ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity? Think also about challenges. Have you overcome them? Now, overcoming challenges is perhaps a part of your story that you'll be directly prompted to address in an essay question that asks you about overcoming challenges. If you are not directly prompted to talk about that, then there are other ways for you to weave that into an application story. And certainly overcoming challenges or adversity is something that admissions officers want to identify as a quality in applicants. Finally, consider any unique family arrangements or an upbringing. I think in sum, when you're looking professionally and personally, you want to try to balance these types of qualities and differentiators in developing your story. That's what we're going to talk about now. Far too many applicants, again, we feel exclusively focus on their professional accomplishments. Yes, you are applying to business school, and we're not encouraging you to not highlight your business accomplishments. But what we're trying to get you to understand is that so are all other applicants. So actually, the best means for you to differentiate yourself and to stand out is through your personal attributes. Your personal attributes are most likely to resonate with admissions officers. You can talk about a leadership example in your past work experience. You can talk about overcoming a difficult boss or situation while you're at work, but it is work. And I feel that admissions officers can, and you can build a stronger connection with admissions officers by talking about your personal interests, your personal hobbies, and who you are. Ideally, your personal and your professional differentiators are going to tie into your overall story. Why do you want to pursue an MBA? So if you have personal interests that are also related to your professional future career interests, that's really powerful. That is really powerful. If you are interested in sustainability consulting, and you have also volunteered at the local zoo, or you love to go hiking in the outback, then it starts to feel much more compelling, and it seems much more justifiable. And so think about both your personal as well as your professional differentiators. The last topic that we're going to talk about now is how you can incorporate your story into your applications. And it's really critical to take advantage of the opportunities that you have to do so, because if you spend all of this time developing and building your story, and then you don't tell your story in a way or in the areas that you can, it's a wasted opportunity. So there are three areas to tell your story and to incorporate your story. You can incorporate your story first and foremost in your essays. The second area is, and it's less obvious, is in your resume. And then finally, your recommendation letters and your interview. Let's dig a little bit deeper into each of these three areas. So your essays are the most obvious area to tell your story. As I've mentioned, you want to tell your story, and your story being why you want to pursue an MBA, why now, why a particular school, what makes you different, even if you're not directly prompted to do so. Most business schools are going to directly prompt you to talk about your interest in those areas, but if they're not, you want to try to anyway. Try to make your voice authentic. What we recommend to our clients is that they write their essays, they edit their essays, and then they read their essays out loud. Does this essay sound like you? Is there a voice? Is there a distinct voice? Is there can you hear you in an essay? Um, don't try to force a topic to a question that does not fit. And that's a trap that many applicants fall into. They'll write an essay for one school and they'll try to apply that essay to another school. And you need to be careful. Your story needs to fit into the question or the essay question that's being prompted of you. You want to give admissions officers a more complete picture of who you are in your essays. Highlight those areas that will not be highlighted in other parts of your application. This will allow you to build a well-rounded application. You don't want to talk about certain examples in your essays that you know will also be talked about in your letters of recommendation. That's really that's not reinforcing, that's a waste. There's so little space for you to tell your story that you need to take advantage of every opportunity that you have to do so. We talked earlier about admissions officers not necessarily admitting well-rounded applicants, but instead building well-rounded classes. Your story is not what you think admissions officers want to hear. And so frequently, applicants will write essays that they don't sound real. They sound like an applicant is writing an essay based on what an admissions officer is looking for. And that's just not the way to write an essay. Be you, and if you are, you'll be able to be genuine and real. And I think that that's really important for applicants that are trying to build a real connection with an admissions officer who is a person who is making a decision on whether or not you're going to be admitted or rejected from their school. If you're not being genuine in your essays, it really will not serve you well. It will come across as fake and phony, and it's just such an easy way for admissions officers to say, I don't like this applicant. They are not likable. They sound fake and phony, and I'm going to reject them. Let's talk about your resume. It's not necessarily about what you have done, but what you have achieved. And too frequently, business school applicants in their resumes are simply bullet pointing out all of their responsibilities. And the reality is, as an admissions officer, I don't really care what your responsibilities were. I mean, I do care. I need to know what you were doing each day, but I'm far less interested in what you are doing and much more interested on what you have been able to achieve. What have you been able to achieve? And whenever possible, make those achievements quantifiable. I want to know how much you have reduced waste. I want to know how much you have increased efficiency. I might, as an admissions officer, have any understanding of the industry or the function that you are working in. So all I can do is look at numbers as a means of giving me a reference point of how impacting or how impactful your accomplishments have been. Your resume also needs to be structured along a similar story arc. Where have you been? Where are you going? Where is business school? And how is business school going to help you achieve those goals? You want to highlight those areas in your past experience, if you're changing careers, that have informed why you are interested in what you say that you are now interested in pursuing. Even though it's your resume and it's more formal, you still need to be active with your writing. You want to be engaging. Don't be passive and boring. Try to get admissions officers engaged with your resume and try to use examples that are not cited in your essays or letters of recommendation. Let's talk finally about your letters of recommendation as well as the interview. Now, you want to give your letter of recommendation writers some sense of what your story strategy is. Their letters of recommendation have to support your story. If your letter of recommendation writers are not clear about what your story is, then they're not going to be able to support that story. And then your story is going to become unfocused. Help them understand your answers to those three questions that we talked about a little bit earlier, and give them guidance on those areas that they can highlight or be complimentary or supportive of your story. If you know, for example, that you're going to be discussing one particular, say, leadership example in an essay, make sure that if they're going to talk about leadership, they're not highlighting the exact same example. So you want to avoid the redundancy or overlap with your story. Your interview is really the final way for you to support and reinforce your story. You want to stick to your story. Your interview is not the time where you decide you're going to tell the interviewer about a whole other story that you've decided on in the time period between when you've submitted your application and when you're sitting down with him or her. Make sure that you have your story down. You've now developed your story in a written format. Make sure that verbally you can express it in the exact same way. If I asked you, make a pitch for yourself in 60 seconds on why you should be admitted to this business school, make sure that you've got it down. And make sure finally that you're building the connection. And we've talked about this over the course of this presentation, and I'll wrap up again with emphasizing the importance of telling your story in a way that resonates. You are building a connection with people. Now, these people are ultimately making a decision on whether or not you're going to be admitted or rejected. So you need to become across as compelling, as likable, as differentiated. And if you can do that, you'll be successful in this process. So to wrap up, I want to just, because it's always nice to take a step back at the end of a presentation and think about, what did I just learn? We've discussed what is an application story. We talked about why your application story is important. We've also talked about building your application story by answering those three key questions. And then we finally wrapped up in talking about how you can incorporate your application story into your application materials. So that's the presentation, and I think we've got a little bit of time now, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come in over the course of the 40 minutes or so.
Fantastic. So, Marc, thank you so much. For those of you who might have joined a little bit late, we've been listening to Marc Zawel, who is the co-founder and CEO of AcceptU, talking about the topic of building a story strategy for MBA applications. So at this point, we are now ready to field some of your questions. I see that we have about 10 minutes remaining in today's webinar. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to Marc, feel free to do so by entering your question right into the chat area on your GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And also, I did see some questions coming in about, where can I find a copy of this presentation? Well, Marc, in his preparation and wise anticipation, he has a link right on the screen in front of you at the bottom. It says, for a copy of this presentation, visit learnmore.acceptu.com/story. So that is where the presentation will be housed. So why don't we just jump right into the questions? I see a question coming from Natasha. Natasha says, most of the forms cover information like awards and achievements, extracurricular activities, and so on, with details on the basis for selection and all that. So should I repeat this information on my resume, or leave that to create more space for work experience related information and other stuff? Basically, is it a good strategy to not repeat stuff in the resume that is covered in the form? Marc, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we generally discourage against redundancy, but I think actually in this situation it would be important for you to do so. The reason being, when it comes to your interview, and it varies from school to school, but some of your interviewers will have evaluated and read your application, and others will have just a copy of your resume. So in a situation where, in that latter situation where an interviewer, say, only has a copy of your resume as a reference point, I think it would be important for them to see those types of highlighted accomplishments at a high level. But generally, you want to try to avoid redundancy. Now, I don't know what type of accomplishments you have listed on your resume, so it depends on on how much of an accomplishment that is. And I don't want to discount or downplay any accomplishment that an applicant is listing on her application or on her resume, but if you have an accomplishment that is really, really powerful and you have an accomplishment that is really differentiated, then certainly play that up. For example, we had, and this is a pretty extreme case, but we've had clients in the past that hold patents, and they'll list it on their resume. We'll have that be part of their story with their essays, with their letters of recommendation, all those pieces, because having a patent is a pretty big deal. Now, most applicants, and I'd probably say, well, the majority, maybe 99.9% of applicants do not. So think about also how impacting and how impactful has your accomplishment been. And if you feel like it's something that really is differentiated and will help you stand out, then certainly I wouldn't discourage you from having it fall into different parts of your application and into your overall story.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark. And Natasha, hopefully that helps. Going along the themes of what you just mentioned, Mark, about redundancy, a question from Nancy. How should you strategize what your 2 to 3 different letters of recommendations talk about? For instance, should your recommenders talk about similar strengths and weaknesses and just provide different examples, or write about different themes altogether?
So two things. The first is I want to talk about selecting your letter of recommendation writers. And many schools will push you to have at least one of your letters be from a direct supervisor. Now, we have gotten questions in the past about who should be writing letters of recommendation. And of course, we could have an entire webinar just on letters of recommendation, but I always think it's important to point out that it's not necessarily who this letter writer is, and it's much more important about how long they've known you and in what capacity. And if they know you in multiple or in different ways, it can be really powerful. If this letter of recommendation writer has known you over 5 years and has seen you grow over 5 years, that's going to be really powerful. Now, if the letter of recommendation writer has known you for far longer, or I'm sorry, for shorter, then it can actually be something that doesn't give them the type of perspective that they need.
Great.
Can you hear me okay? So the second part is about what should these letter of recommendation writers be discussing. And I think that when you share with them the strengths and the differentiators that are a part of your application, it can fall within your story. And there can be some overlap. What I try to discourage and what we try to discourage among our clients is that the same examples be used. That I feel like is a wasted opportunity. But for the most part, develop your story. Think about what are your strengths or what are your differentiators. Share those types of qualities and differentiators with your letter of recommendation writers. And from there, have them incorporate examples that can support those differentiators.
Okay. Well, why don't we move on to another question from Arjun. Arjun's asking, Mark, how do you stay in touch with programs after you've submitted your application? Does it help in the application process to stay in touch? Is it appropriate to update schools with year-end compensation information or other types of information? Thoughts on that, Mark?
So it's funny, we just published a blog post today specifically on what steps applicants can take after their application has been submitted. So this is pretty timely. What I would say is there is a fine line between updating admissions officers and keeping in contact with admissions officers and overwhelming them with updates on small nuances that have occurred in your application status in the time since you've submitted your application and when they reviewed your application. I think that if you have significant accomplishments, if there have been significant changes to your application, to your work experience or otherwise, certainly update the admissions office. Another reason why you might want to update the admissions office is if that school has now become your top choice. We've talked about this in previous webinars, but the demonstration of interest allows admissions officers to mitigate a lot of uncertainty associated with whether admitted applicants will actually attend. If you've decided that that school is your top choice, you should let admissions officers know of that. And you can tell them very directly, if I am admitted to your program, I will attend. And I think that that might be a a real way for you to stand out in the process. But if you're just updating them on small changes to your application, it's really not worth doing so. It's just not. It's going to be something that gets put into your application. It's going to be something that's generally overlooked. And think also about admissions officers and how busy they are once applications have been submitted. So unless you have something really important to tell them, I would discourage you from contacting them, just given what is on their plate after the application deadlines have closed.
Very good. And I do indeed see that blog post, Mark, that you referenced about this very topic. So for the audience members, you can go to acceptu.com/blog, and it is the post at the very top, published today. So highly recommend that you check out this this article as well. Let's see. I think we have time for just one more question, Mark, and it'll be from Rish. So Rish is asking, what if you've been laid off or fired? How do you handle that in your application?
I think that it's not something that is that unique anymore. Given the economic environment and the economic climate and the job climate here in the U.S. and outside of the U.S., having been laid off or losing work, it's really not something that can hurt you in the process. And I know that admissions officers are understanding of what's happening in this type of economic climate. Now, what is important is telling them what you have done in the time since you have been laid off. Have you been looking for other jobs? Have you taken up other interests? Have you been applying to business school? Whatever it is, you want to fill them in, because again, it ties into owning your story. You can't let admissions officers draw their own conclusions. If you don't tell them what has happened in that time period, they won't know. Maybe they'll think that you've been sitting around watching television. What's for them to know that you haven't? So be honest and be clear and be upfront about how you've been spending your time since then. And I think that going through that type of experience can also be very beneficial in terms of having that type of experience be an experience that you have gone through yourself. Because certainly going to business school, training to become a future manager or leader, layoffs or unemployment is something that you'll likely experience again. Maybe not on the receiving end, but maybe you will be the one doing that. And I think that experience is not something that will be looked negatively upon, but admissions officers will want to know, what have you done in the time period since you have lost your job?
And with that, I think we're going to conclude today's webinar. Again, we've been speaking with Marc Zawel, who's a co-founder and CEO of AcceptU, and he's been providing us advice in presentation and Q&A form about building a story strategy for MBA applications. Marc, thank you so much for spending time with us today to talk about this topic.
Thanks, Eric, for having me.
Great. And just before everyone hangs up the call today, I wanted to mention a few things. Again, this presentation will be available at learnmore.acceptu.com/story. That's where you can find a copy of this presentation, so check that out. Again, I mentioned acceptu.com/blog is another resource that you should check out, because there was a question that was addressed in article form that you can take a look at from today. And finally, I do want to mention that the Beat The GMAT community has a very special privilege with AcceptU folks. The kind folks at AcceptU have offered to allow BTG members to schedule a complimentary admissions assessment with a former MBA admissions officer. So if you want to take advantage of this complimentary offer, you can go to learnmore.acceptu.com/webinar. It's the link is right on the slide here, and we're also going to be following up by email after this presentation. So if you don't have a pen or paper in front of you, we'll let you know what that link is by email. So again, huge thanks to our good friends at AcceptU, as well as Marc, and to our Beat The GMAT community. Wishing you very happy holidays. Enjoy time with family and friends, and hopefully we'll come back refreshed in 2013, ready to apply to business school. All the best to you all.